Clint Eastwood and Sergio Leone. What if the man who made you a star also tried to kill you off, on camera, in the opening scene of his next movie? That's not a metaphor. It actually happened. And the way the two men involved handled it says more about ego, gratitude, and letting go than almost any Hollywood story you've heard. This is the story of Clint Eastwood and Sergio Leone, the director who built a legend, and the actor who eventually outgrew him. No screaming matches, no tabloid meltdown, just two stubborn geniuses, a slow-motion falling out, and a goodbye that took 20 years and exactly 4 words to say. Stick around, because the ending will surprise you. Let's go back to 1963. Clint Eastwood was a working actor, sure, but not a movie star. He was playing a cowboy on a TV show, the kind of gig that pays the bills but doesn't turn heads. Then his agent rings him up with an offer so unglamorous, it's almost funny. Hop on a plane to Europe and shoot a low-budget western in Spain, financed by a patchwork of Italian, German, and Spanish money, based loosely on a Japanese samurai film. The director's name was unpronounceable to most Americans. The paycheck was $15 grand. Total, not per week. No trailer, no entourage. 8 weeks in a country where he didn't speak a word of the language. His own agent told him flat out, "This is a bad career move." And Eastwood said yes anyway. Here's why that decision matters. Eastwood wasn't chasing the money. There wasn't much to chase. He wanted to watch movie making stripped to its bones, far from Hollywood's rules and Hollywood's spotlight. What he found was controlled chaos. A crew speaking 3 or 4 languages at once. Nobody flinching over a stray noise on the mic, as long as the shot looked right. The director, Sergio Leone, barely spoke English. He directed through gestures and pantomime, relaying instructions through a translator like a game of telephone. So Eastwood improvised. He built the character his own way, trusting his gut, while Leone watched through the camera and kept everything that worked. Two men who could barely hold a conversation ended up building something extraordinary purely through images. No words required. They shot that film in the dust and heat of southern Spain, standing in for the American frontier, on a shoestring budget of around $200,000. When it hit Italian theaters that September, it exploded. Suddenly audiences who'd never given this American TV actor a second thought couldn't stop talking about him. The squint, the poncho, the way he said almost nothing, and somehow said everything. Funny enough, Eastwood didn't even smoke in real life. Those thin, cheap cigars were just a prop. But combined with the desert light and that unreadable face, they helped create an icon. But here's the real lesson Eastwood took from that shoot. And it's not the fame, it's the math. He'd just watched a film made fast, made cheap, made completely outside the studio system, and it had conquered an entire continent. File that away, because it's the exact seed that eventually grows into the reason these two men stop working together. Now, Leone had a theory about Eastwood that almost nobody else believed at the time. Studio executives saw a serviceable TV actor, tall, flat voice, never carried a real film. Leone saw a face, and specifically, what that face did when it did nothing at all. The stillness. The refusal to oversell an emotion. The way Eastwood could hold an expression a beat too long and pull the audience closer instead of losing them. Most directors want their leading men to act, to reach, to emote, to sell it big for the cheap seats. Leone wanted the opposite. He wanted his lead to wait. Years later, Leone put it bluntly, and it's a colder statement than you'd expect from the man who supposedly discovered Eastwood. He said he needed a mask more than an actor. He praised Eastwood's face constantly, called himself obsessive about casting the right faces. But by his own account, in those early days, Eastwood barely had range. 2 expressions, with the hat, without the hat. Sit with that for a second. The director everyone credits for discovering Clint Eastwood didn't think he'd found a movie star. He thought he'd found a great jaw attached to a blank canvas. And weirdly, it worked, because it flipped the entire Western genre on its head. The typical cowboy hero explained himself constantly, talked through his feelings, justified every choice out loud. Eastwood did none of that. Leone built whole sequences around silence, the camera crawling slowly across a squint, an unlit cigar, a hand hovering near a holster. The less Eastwood gave the audience, the more they leaned in and filled in the blanks themselves. Some of that was pure directorial philosophy. Some of it, honestly, was just necessity. They literally couldn't communicate any other way. Leone knew maybe one word of English. Eastwood knew maybe one word of Italian. So they leaned on the one language they both spoke fluently: the image. Leone framed the shot and mimed the intention. Eastwood filled it in by instinct. The limitation became the style. On paper, this partnership should have lasted forever. Leone had the eye, Eastwood had the face. Together, they'd invented a brand new kind of Western the world had genuinely never seen before. It wasn't friendship exactly. It was rarer than that. Two artists completing each other's instincts without ever really understanding each other's words. But the very thing that made it work was already planting the seed that would eventually break it, because Leone had started wanting something Eastwood simply didn't want. And in a couple of years, that hunger would put a decision in front of Eastwood that changed everything. Let's talk numbers, because money tells this story better than gossip. On that first Spanish Western, Eastwood made $15,000 on a film that cost roughly $200,000 and turned Leone into an overnight international name. The sequel bumped his pay to $50,000 on a slightly bigger budget. Two guys climbing the same ladder, splitting the same rising fame. Then came the epic third film, and the budget ballooned to roughly $1.25 million, 6 times what the first film cost. Eastwood was watching closely, because that money wasn't going toward him. It was going toward spectacle. Leone had caught the scale bug. He wanted bigger sets, bigger battles, bigger everything. A town leveled by cannon fire. A sprawling, brutal prisoner of war camp. An entire staged civil war sprawled across the Spanish countryside. The runtime stretched past 2.5 hours, and the quiet, still, controlled performance that had made the first film crackle with tension started getting buried under armies and explosions. One moment says it all. Leone rigged an actual bridge with real explosives for a single shot. When the take didn't turn out the way he wanted, he had the bridge rebuilt from scratch and blown up a second time. Budget be damned. To Leone, no image was too expensive if it was the right image. To Eastwood, that was money being torched for a shot that honestly didn't need to be that enormous. That was the turning point. Eastwood looked at the swelling budgets, the bloated runtimes, entire armies crowding him out of frames that used to belong entirely to him. And he understood something Leone apparently never fully grasped. Leone wasn't making movies about the man with no name anymore. He was making movies about Sergio Leone. And Eastwood had become an expensive prop in someone else's grand vision. Leone loved sprawling, long pictures. And to be fair, if the story earns that length, fine. But Eastwood's philosophy was completely different. If you're stretching a film just to inflate production value, trim it down. Why blow a fortune on cannon fire when one perfectly timed close-up would hit twice as hard? So while the rest of the world fell head over heels for that finished epic, it eventually pulled in something like $40 million at the box office. Eastwood had quietly already made up his mind. He was done climbing someone else's ladder. He didn't announce it. He didn't confront anyone. He just started building his own operation, under a name that only made sense once you knew the backstory, so that no director would ever again crowd him out of his own movie. That company was called Malpaso. Near Eastwood's home in Carmel, California, there's a small creek called Malpaso Creek, Spanish for roughly, bad step or wrong turn. That's the exact phrase his own agent had used back in 1963 to warn him off that cheap Spanish Western. So when Eastwood built his production empire on the fortune that bad step ultimately earned him, he named the whole company after the insult, a quiet, permanent middle finger to anyone who doubted the gamble. He founded Malpaso in 1967, and the timing could not have been more loaded, because that was the exact moment everything shifted for both men. For 3 years, thanks to a tangled rights dispute, that original Western trilogy had only played in Europe. American audiences hadn't seen a single frame of it. Then in 1967, all three films finally opened in the United States at once, and the country lost its mind over them. As late as the following year, some columnists were still asking who this Clint Eastwood guy even was. Within months, nobody needed to ask anymore. That flipped the entire power dynamic overnight. As long as the films only played in Europe, Leone was the engine, and Eastwood was just along for the ride. The moment American money and American fame started pouring in, Eastwood didn't need Leone at all anymore. He had his own company, his own leverage, and a face the entire planet suddenly recognized. The $15,000 unknown was now a one-man industry. He proved it almost immediately. Malpaso's first production tackled capital punishment, meatier material than the westerns he'd been cast in before. It paid him $400,000 plus a quarter of the profits, meaning he now made more owning a picture than Leone had ever paid him to headline one. It opened to the biggest weekend in its studio's history, bigger than any James Bond release before it. And then Eastwood made the cleanest statement of all, just by walking away. He'd spent the back half of the 60s stuck in dubbing booths, re-recording dialogue for the English versions of Leone's films, grinding through endless press junkets, treated more like the product than the artist who made it worth selling. He swore he'd never feel that powerless again. From that point on, with one notable exception, he'd essentially never again star in a movie he didn't control. Which brings us to the strangest chapter in this whole relationship. The moment Leone came back with an offer that was somehow both a tribute and an execution. By this point, Leone had decided he was finished with westerns as a genre. He felt he'd said everything he wanted to say with them. But a major Hollywood studio dangled an enormous budget in front of him, plus the chance to work with Henry Fonda, an actor Leone had idolized since childhood. So he agreed to make one final western, and he wanted to open it by symbolically killing off everything that came before. In his own words, years later, Leone explained the idea. He wanted to say a stylish, deliberate goodbye to the three iconic characters from his earlier trilogy, and to the very rules of filmmaking he himself had invented. He wanted to close the book on that gritty, dusty, low-budget European western and open a brand new chapter, a big, sweeping Hollywood-scale western instead. Here's the plan. The film opens with three hired gunmen waiting at a desolate train station for a mysterious man known only as Harmonica. He steps off the train, exchanges a few words, and guns all three men down in the first 10 minutes of the movie. And Leone wanted those three doomed gunmen, played by the very actors who'd built his empire: Eastwood, Lee Van Cleef, and Eli Wallach. The good, the bad, and the ugly themselves, gunned down together in the opening scene of his new masterpiece, so the whole world would understand, unmistakably, that the old era was officially over. Two of the three said yes. Wallach was in. Van Cleef, whose career had gotten a fresh jolt from his work with Leone, was willing. Eastwood was the lone holdout. He said no. And that single refusal didn't just cancel one cameo. It collapsed the entire symbolic send-off. Once Eastwood walked, there was no point using the other two either, because the whole idea only worked as a trio. And Eastwood wasn't finished saying no. Leone then offered him the actual starring role, Harmonica himself, the emotional core of the entire film. Eastwood turned that down too, for reasons that, by most accounts, boiled down to one simple fact. He no longer wanted to work with Sergio Leone. The man who had built him from nothing offered him the biggest role of his career, twice, and twice Eastwood closed the door. Here's where the story gets genuinely strange though. Leone told this account, the offer, the rejection, the symbolic funeral scene, for the rest of his life. Eastwood's own recollections don't fully line up. In at least one interview, he flatly denies ever being offered that opening scene in the first place. So either Leone reached out in good faith to honor their history and got turned down cold, or the wound Leone carried around for decades wasn't quite the story Eastwood remembered living through. Two legends, two completely different versions of events, and a silence in between that neither man ever fully cleared up. Whatever actually happened, the outcome was the same. The role of harmonica went to Charles Bronson, who, in a strange twist, had turned down the role that made Eastwood famous years earlier, on that first Spanish Western. The actor who said no to becoming Eastwood ended up inheriting the part Eastwood said no to. Full circle, in the strangest way possible. Eastwood never made another film with Sergio Leone. Not that one, not the sprawling gangster epic Leone made afterward, not anything. The partnership that essentially invented Clint Eastwood as a movie star ended not with a blow-up, but with one man quietly declining to attend his own on-screen funeral. And for more than 2 decades, that's exactly where things stayed, unresolved, unexplained, hanging in the air. Then Leone died, and everything changed. Leone passed away in the spring of 1989, his glory days as a director well behind him. The two men had never patched things up, never worked together again, never publicly addressed what had actually pulled them apart. And here's the twist that flips the whole bitter feud narrative on its head. When Leone was gone, Eastwood didn't settle any scores. He reached back across nearly 25 years of silence and quietly honored him. It happened at the very end of a film called Unforgiven, released in 1992, the movie that would go on to define Eastwood's entire legacy as a filmmaker. It's a brutal, mournful, deeply unglamorous Western about an aging killer with none of the old swagger left in him. It won Best Picture. It won Eastwood Best Director. And in a quiet way, the whole film was a demolition of the exact myth Leone had spent years constructing around him. The stoic, untouchable man with no name, stripped bare, and shown instead as a haunted old man who flinches at the very violence he used to make look beautiful on screen. Eastwood had spent his career living inside the icon Leone built. With this film, he took that icon apart, piece by piece, in front of the whole world. And when the credits rolled, 4 words appeared on screen, dedicated to Sergio and Don. Sergio Leone and Don Siegel, the 2 directors Eastwood always credited as the men who shaped him most. The mentor he'd walked away from decades earlier, and the mentor who later shaped his American career, folded together into a single quiet line at the end of his masterpiece. The man who wouldn't even show up for his own symbolic funeral had just dedicated the film that dismantled his own legend to the very man who created that legend in the first place. So why do it? After all the refusals, all the distance, all those years of saying absolutely nothing. Eastwood himself came about as close as he ever would to explaining it, saying that there were 2 people who'd shaped him at crucial moments in his life, and by strange coincidence, both had passed away within a short span of each other, which is why he wanted to pay tribute to the 2 men who'd influenced him so deeply, adding that whether or not they'd had any direct hand in that particular film, he liked to think they would have appreciated the story anyway. That's the whole answer, and it's a lot quieter than the legend wants it to be. There was no explosive feud. There was a young actor who learned everything he possibly could from a brilliant, difficult, visionary director. Watched that director drift toward a style of filmmaking he no longer wanted any part of, and made the hard, unglamorous call to walk away before the machine swallowed him whole. He left. He built his own world from scratch, and when the man who made him was finally gone, he reached back across the silence and simply said thank you. There's one last little irony buried in all this too. Remember Leone's harsh comment about Eastwood only having 2 facial expressions? Some say that jab only came up because Eastwood had already turned him down for that big Western. Even the cruelest thing Leone ever said publicly about his former star might really have just been the sting of being told no. 2 legends spent decades orbiting each other through interviews and silence and second-hand stories, and the only truly clean, direct word either of them ever spoke to the other came in the form of 4 words on a movie screen, years after it was too late for a reply. So what actually went wrong between these 2 men? Honestly, maybe nothing did. That's the twist the whole story hides. No screaming match, no betrayal, no scandal worth a headline. Just a brilliant director who found a broke television actor willing to work for pocket change, turned him into the most recognizable face on the planet, and became a legend himself doing it. Then that legend got hungry for scale, And somewhere under all those armies and explosions, the one still, quiet man at the center of it stopped being the point of the picture. And that's the lesson Leone taught Eastwood, without ever meaning to. The person who controls the money controls the picture, and the star who doesn't is just a mask hired out to somebody else's vision. Eastwood learned that on a redetonated bridge in Spain, and made sure he'd never pay that price again. So he walked. He turned down the biggest role of his mentor's career, twice. He built an empire on an inside joke about taking a bad step, and he became one of the most powerful filmmakers in Hollywood history, while the man who discovered him spent his final working years chasing budgets for studios that no longer fully trusted his instincts. And here's the part that really stings. The student turned out to be right. Eastwood is still out there working well into his 90s, still making films, still the only person who's ever truly owned Clint Eastwood. That's the real answer he finally gave. Not through a big confession, but through 4 quiet words on a movie screen, and 60 years of simply saying no when he needed to. It was never hatred. It was never a grudge. The director who invented Clint Eastwood also ended up teaching him, without ever meaning to, exactly why he'd never need a director like that again. So here's the real question for you. Was Eastwood right to walk away from the man who made him? Or did he owe Sergio Leone something more than 4 words? Drop your take in the comments, and if you enjoyed digging into this one, go ahead and like this video and subscribe for more stories from behind the camera you probably never knew about.